We continue to explore the theme of work to be done in Christian personalism, and then also the related themes of avoiding quote-unquote bad personalism, the risks, some of the inherent risks within personalist thought, and then also dealing with new emerging issues that personalism can speak to. And the format will be one in which each of the speakers makes a set of remarks and will speak between 10 and 15 minutes. And then we'll probably cut straight to Q&A from the audience to provide plenty of time for that. And there was an announcement that I think we will delay until at the end of this session that I'll have Lindsay announce, but it concerns those of you who have received some scholarship for your presence here. So make sure you don't rush out of here if you're interested in receiving the scholarship. So on that note, we'll go left to right.
Very good. So this is an important aspect of our work when we think of the future of personalism. What are the particular vulnerabilities of personalism? What are its natural dangers, and how do we counteract them? I mentioned one at the end of the session with Professor Buttiglione, the individualism that it can be confused with personalism, though in fact we see in the history of personalism a very strong sense of social solidarity in the great personalists. But there's another different danger of personalism that I would like to address, and I would call it the danger of an angelistic personalism, or or a spiritualistic personalism. A personalism that works with a disordered person-body dualism. It's expressed actually in the saying of that American feminist that I already quoted. She is in the process of rejecting all the fundamentals of Christian sexual morality, and she sums up her position in apparently personalist language, saying, God doesn't care what we do with each other's bodies. He just cares whether we respect each other as persons. And so the idea is that this respect for persons has no particular definite embodiment. We can enter into any kind of sexual contact we want, as long as we, from within, inform that sexual contact with respect for the other. So there's a distinctly disembodied personalism that resonates in that utterance of hers. And it seems to me that this overwrought dualism of person and body can grow out of just that stress on subjectivity that I examined in our very first meeting on Monday. If we say that it's this interiority of the person that really expresses the person, then what's on the outside, what's over against the person, seems outside and not the person. And so the body, being outside of my intimate interiority, seems to be something other than myself as person. And you see how there's a kind of plausible move into the angelistic personalism. I want to show you a statement from Joseph Fletcher, the famous defender of situation ethics a generation or so ago. He was actually a Protestant theologian, but defended situation ethics in a very radical form. And in part, his situation ethics was based on this person-body dualism. And he says here in sentences that seem to me very revealing the following. Physical nature, that is, the human body and its members, our organs and their functions. All of these are a part of what is over against us. And if we live by the rules and conditions set in physiology, we reduce ourselves to an it, not a thou. He goes on, freedom, knowledge, choice, responsibility, all of these things of personal or moral stature are in us, not out there. Physical nature, including the human body, is what is over against us out there. It represents the world of the it. So there you see, in almost grotesque form, this sense of the body as somehow outside of the person, an empirical thing available for any manipulation, but our moral lives are in good personalist order as long as the innermost stances of the person are correct. Now, I want to think just a little more concretely about what it means to affirm the embodiment of persons, and to think of the body not as a thing over against the person, but as that in and through which we are embodied and exist as whole persons. And I want to show you just a few sentences from Dietrich von Hildebrand speaking about the nature of human sexuality, sexuality being a very significant point at which the person is embodied. So let me read just these sentences and then reflect on it from the point of view of this angelistic personalism. Von Hildebrand writes, this is in the great book on the nature of purity, in a certain sense, sex is the secret of the individual, which he instinctively hides from others. Every person feels it to be altogether intimate, touching in a unique way his or her innermost self. Every disclosure of sex opens up something hidden, something intimate in the person, initiating the other into the secret of the one who discloses himself. This is why shame has its natural place in the sphere of sex. And he adds, this intimacy shows us again the particular depth of the sensual sphere in contrast to the other appetites of the vital life, like hunger and thirst. So the idea of von Hildebrand is that this most intimate self of the person is sexually embodied. And his thought is, that's in the nature of the person. You can't undo that. You can't renounce that. You can't trivialize your sexual activity, detaching it from this intimate center of the person. This intimate self is intrinsically embodied in the sexual energy of each person. But from the point of view of the spiritualistic personalism, well, I can make of that sexual energy whatever I want. If I want it just to mean pleasurable entertainment, if I want to trivialize it, I can do that. That lies with me as person, to let this sexual energy have this rich personal resonance, or be something just peripheral to me as person that involves nothing deep, no significant commitments. So there you see what the difference is between acknowledging the embodiment, the embodiment given to us, not chosen by us, of ourselves, as opposed to this idea that the person can manipulate his or her sexuality, letting it mean as much or little as he or she chooses. But there are many other ways in which we see this person-body dualism in bioethics. It turns up in many destructive ways. Think simply of the whole idea of cloning. Let's take the case of cloning with a reproductive intent. And you know how that goes, where the egg of a woman is denucleated and the nucleus of the being to be cloned is inserted into that egg, and it is stimulated to begin dividing like an embryo, and you get an exact genetic copy of the person who contributed the new nucleus to the clone. Well, it has been very well said that to bring a human being into existence like this is in effect to manufacture a human being. It's a matter of making and producing. Whereas when a new human being arises through the sexual intimacy of a man and woman in a committed relation of love, then the embodiment of the parents is expressed. Whereas they, as it were, step outside their body, reduce the sperm and egg simply to biological materials which are manipulated into a new human being. Only a world in which persons have become very estranged from their bodies and think of themselves somehow as disembodied, only in such a world could this reproductive cloning ever be taken seriously. And there's still other forms in bioethics. You all know how one says, well, the early embryo, it's certainly a human being, but it's not a person. Or the adult in permanent vegetative state, well, he's certainly a human being, but not a person. So that contrast between human and person, which wreaks so much havoc in bioethics, is based also on this person-body dualism. I mentioned also the gender dysphoria, where the person says, well, biologically, I'm a man, but let me tell you, from the inside, I feel ever so much like a woman. That's my real gender. Well, there too, obviously, this sense of personhood, of disembodied, unnaturally disembodied personhood is at work. But there are other areas too where you see it at work. There's a really significant passage in John Paul's encyclical Veritatis Splendor, where he deals with the so-called fundamental option theory. That is the idea that there is the center of each person's moral life, a fundamental decision for God, and that decision may be made for God even though at the level of my concrete bodily actions, I'm doing very wrong things. So while committing adultery or doing violence to other persons or stealing their property, I may still, in this innermost center, be saying yes to God. And so at that deepest level, my moral life is in order, even though at this more extrinsic level of bodily actions, there's nothing but moral disorder. When you do more justice to the embodiment of persons, you see how those actions like committing the adultery or doing violence to a person, that's, in those actions, that basic stance to God is enacted. We take our stance in and through those bodily actions with moral significance. But if you have the body cast it off into the position of a kind of object, then the bodily activities get detached from this unnatural interiority, where the fundamental option for God is made. And so John Paul very wisely, when he deals with this in the encyclical Veritatis Splendor, reaffirms the unity of body and soul, reaffirms all the truth contained in the idea that the soul is the form of the body. It's not just using the body like an instrument. That is just what needs to be recovered in order to make sense of the unity of our moral lives and the unity of significant bodily actions and the basic stance that we take toward God. But the mischief of this person-body dualism isn't even limited to all the cases I've mentioned. It seems to me that in the social media, in the texting and tweeting and emails, you have a very disembodied way of communicating one person with another. The other with whom you communicate is kept at a safe distance. You read the email when you're ready to read it. That unscripted spontaneity of the face-to-face encounter where embodied persons meet each other, that is all somehow rendered, it's subject to control and made safer by the communication through these social media. You might say, to go back to that Guardini passage I looked at with you, that you can preserve that armored condition of yourself vis-a-vis the other in this kind of communication with digital technology, and that vulnerability of the I-thou can be avoided. And finally, even with education, the embodied nature of teaching, the seeing the teacher embodied in the flesh, and encountering the teacher face to face, the unique educational value of that is often lost. And we have endless debates at this university, and I'm sure my colleagues at other universities have it, about online education, and is that the future of education? Some of my colleagues even want to tell me this is better still than the face-to-face education. But I think that it is somehow a disembodied version, and thereby a certain depersonalized version of education. And of course, one has to find a way to make some reasonable use of all that technology and online possibilities. But when it begins to replace that lived, embodied, face-to-face encounter of teacher and student, then it's gone too far. And then this spirit of angelistic personalism is disrupting the genius of education. I might conclude with just one striking sentence of Newman, as great an educator as there ever was. And he's talking about here in this place, particularly religious education. And he asks, well, how is this carried out? Best of all, some might think it's carried out mainly by reading the Bible. Newman says, its great instrument, the great instrument of religious education, has ever been that which nature prescribes in all education, the personal presence of a teacher, or in theological language, oral tradition. It is the living voice, the breathing form, the expressive countenance which preaches, which catechizes. And so that is, in effect, a plea for thinking of this event of teaching and transmitting truth and forming virtue in the student, a plea for thinking of that in embodied terms and not disfiguring it in the spirit of this person-body dualism. So there are a host of instances for you and for our discussion of how, if we lose a true sense of our embodiment as persons, all kinds of disorder and evils enter our lives. And so I see it as a great task for the future of personalism, to think more deeply about and understand better and explain better this embodiment of us human persons.
Does one hear it? Okay. Well, after this very interesting lecture or short lecture of Professor Crosby, I don't have anything to add anymore.
Highly unlikely.
Well, I want to make a few comments. One is a general remark about personalism. I have a certain, let's say, misgiving about this, the use of this term, because it is, in a certain way, on the one hand, a vague collection of many different philosophies, many of which are quite opposite to each other. For example, very objectivistic and realistic personalisms like that of Karl Wojtyla or that of Dietrich von Hildebrand, and then quite a few trends in philosophy that are quite subjectivistic and relativistic, and also call themselves personalism. And so it seems a bit like the term phenomenology. If you don't add a realist terminology, the term phenomenology is also a very confusing one, where any number of different conceptions are grouped under this term, and so I have a certain problem with that. Also because if it is a special kind of philosophy, one would perhaps expect that it has a certain clear understanding of a method that it follows. But it seems to me that it is that this is extremely diverse analytic philosophies and phenomenologists and atomists and so on. So I have some questions about it. Therefore, I think if one speaks of personalism, as I tried to say in my paper on personalism and personalisms, one should be very clear about what are the elements, the necessary elements for a true personalism, and distinguish them clearly from false kinds of personalisms. And what Professor Crosby said about what he, to my surprise, called angelistic dualism, the kind of personalism, like the personalism of Mr. Trump seems to be, in his opinion, an angelistic dualism, which who prides himself of all his adulteries, and I never conceived of that as a dualism nor as an angelistic dualism. But anyway, what Professor Crosby means certainly is a very true danger. To me, it seems more like an opposite of personalism, namely a conception of the human body as, well, God doesn't care what we do with our body, and we can do anything. And it seems to me that I don't see that as so much as a danger of personalism, but rather a lack of personalism in the sense that it fails to understand the integral role of the human body, of the lived human body, for an understanding of the person. And the quotes from Hildebrand's book that Professor Crosby made on the meaning of human sexuality, and also what he cited of Fletcher, the opposite opinion. I think here it seems to me that personalism is precisely, I see only in the conception of the human body that understands its deep personal meaning in human love and sexuality, in marriage, and that if you divorce it so much, well, I understand why Professor Crosby calls it angelism, or a kind of total separation of the life of a soul that seems completely unrelated to what happens in the body. But on the other hand, one could also see it as a certain crude kind of existential monism that does not respect the existence of a spiritual soul and its deep relationship to the body. But however you call it, certainly this type of lack of understanding the personal meaning of the human body is a great error. And whether you call it a danger of personalism, or a personalistic error, or a kind of anti-personalistic error, is of secondary importance. I think this danger that Professor Crosby mentions and that he opposes to the real understanding of personalism that includes the understanding of the personal meaning of the human body is certainly a very important positive point he makes about personalism, and a very good critique of a kind of deviation from that true personalism in the form of such a lack of sensitivity and lack of understanding of the deep personal meaning of the human body, in particular of human sexuality, and therefore can be contrasted with the profound intuitions in this area of Hildebrand, or of Karl Wojtyla in his fantastic, great theology and philosophy of the human body. Now, I think there's another tendency in personalism that I find a bit disturbing, and that is, I criticized it in my article on the book Introducción al Personalismo of Juan Manuel Burgos, namely that he just seems to call personalists only those who call themselves so, and who are deriving from Monnier, and he has a certain list of people, and he seems to say that if you call anybody personalist like Augustine or Thomas Aquinas or anything outside of that historical school, then that's an abuse of the term, as it were. So you must restrict the term personalism to this particular school. And I think that is of course, quite different from the conception of personalism that was underlying this particular summer school, where Cardinal Newman or Kierkegaard or other great thinker, Thomas Aquinas, was presented also as having many profoundly personalistic intuitions. And in many respects, as you will see in a second, I think that that St. Augustine or also Thomas Aquinas are much more personalistic than some of these personalists with whom Burgos reckons among the personalists. And I will explain that a little more. I think that one great danger in personalism, one great deviation is when personalism becomes completely subjectivistic, when it interprets the subjectivity or the consciousness of the person as an origin of a totally relative conception of the world as just consisting of objects or intentional objects of consciousness. And in that moment, I think it is a profoundly anti-realistic tendency in philosophy, and there are some so-called personalists that go very much in that direction, or in the direction, for example, of those moral theologians and ethicists who deny any objectively and intrinsically wrong actions, who try to reduce everything to the level of the subjective conscience, moral conscience, and find a kind of anti-personalism and legalism in any recognition of actions that objectively and intrinsically are wrong. And then you have, under the flag of personalism, a complete ethical, subjectivism of a certain kind. Another danger I see in personalism could be called an actualism, that is a lack of a metaphysics of the person, and where you reduce somehow the being of the person to the conscious experience and life of the person, and then say that, for example, an Alzheimer patient is no more a person because he cannot act as a person. He cannot speak anymore. He doesn't remember things. He doesn't have the autonomy of his actions that a person should have. Or a baby, an embryo, is not a person. And it's ridiculous that an embryo or a fertilized egg is a person, because what does it make a person? It cannot talk, it cannot speak, it cannot integrate in society, and so on. So you have, for example, in the bioethics of Tristram Engelhardt, the view that until a baby is 1.5 years old, it is not a person, and because it doesn't have the specific acts of persons. So I think that type of conception of the person lacks entirely the concept of the soul, the concept of the ontology of the person, the fact that the being of the person cannot be reduced to the ability of acting as a person. And so I think it is one big aberration. I accuse also your colleague Pat Lee of this type of actualism in his defense of the brain death concept of the human person, where he says that if the brain is destroyed, the person is a living organism still, but he cannot feel pain, and therefore he cannot think anymore, and therefore he's only like a lettuce, a kind of vegetable. So I think that the person can very well exist in an unconscious state, in sleep, if he's seriously mentally retarded or has some serious problems, and the being of the person is constituted by the reality of his soul in union with the body, and therefore, as long as we must assume that this continues, we must assume that the man, a human being, is a person. Now, this actualism, I think, fails to see the notion of the person as an individual substance of rational nature. This, I think, is insufficient, as Professor Buttiglione emphasized. It fails to mention the relationship that is fundamental for the understanding of the person. But it is, I think, an unrenounceable truth not complete truth, but a truth. And if you give up that notion that the person is an individual substance, then you begin to reduce the person to the actual ability and actual performance of acts of persons. And I think that has disastrous consequences, not only for the understanding of the death or the problem of brain death. I'm an opponent of that notion, but also for the embryo, for the abortion question, for the bioethics at the beginning of life, and for many other parts of ethics. So I think that's a very false personalism that reduces the being of the person to the state in which the person can act as a person, can, so to speak, function as a person. There's another danger, I think, in personalism, and therefore, from that point of view, I think that the lectures we heard from Jonathan on Thomas, that St. Thomas or St. Augustine are much more true personalists than many of the people who call themselves personalists. And here, I think there is the danger of personalists to identify the notion of person and the notion of man. I accuse also Burgos of that in his introduction to personalism book. He uses the term person and man interchangeably. And I think that a true personalism presupposes that we understand that the human person is a very kind of finite and limited person, and that the fullness of being a person is only given in God, and that also angels are persons, and that if you restrict the notion of person to man and identify the two, I think you have a kind of metaphysics-less personalism, which is at least potentially an atheism, and which I think fails to understand the ultimate cause and root also of the human personhood. And from that point of view, I see it as an important part of authentic, true personalism to not identify man and person, but to understand that there is a hierarchy of personal beings, and that above all, the absolute, the divine being must be conceived as person. And I think that it is not only the object of our faith as Christians, that God is even three persons in one God who subsists in three persons and in a communion, unspeakably close, perfect communion of these three persons, but that I think also philosophically there are many proofs of the personhood of God. In this I differ from Max Scheler, who thought that in his philosophy of religion that the personhood of God is the alpha and omega of all religious conceptions of God, authentic religious conceptions of God, but that philosophy can only arrive at some kind of first motor or some first cause, but not at the personhood of God. I disagree with that very much, as I will explain in a second a little more. I think what Professor Buttiglione suggested, that I rename my book Essere Persona in the English version, which I am now finishing for publication and enlarging in this publication. Being is person. I think that's very true in the sense that the ultimate being, the supreme and absolute being, and also the being in the highest sense in the world is being a person. So the person is being in the primary sense and being in the absolute sense. But I think to restrict being to persons would be a mistake. It would appear as if the animals and the material world were just nothing. and therefore I'm still not sure whether I should call my book Being is Person or other Being and Person, but anyway. The final point I want to make in the 2 or 3 seconds Professor Crosby still gives me minutes, is that I think a task of personalism in this full and metaphysical sense, an important task consists in precisely developing also on the level of a philosophy of God, the ways in which we can come to understand the personhood of God. And in this sense, in my book it's only in Spanish and in German, Conocimiento de Dios por las vías de la razón y del amor in Spanish, I try to show how the Thomistic 5 ways can be reinterpreted in a completely personalistic sense, in that the unmoved mover as the eternal being is a being that the notion of the eternity of God is only possible to conceive correctly if one understands the personhood of God, and that also the third way from the contingent being to the necessary being is only correctly understood if the act of creation is understood as a free personal act, because otherwise the problem of Parmenides, that the world would also have to be necessary, or that it could not even exist if it flowed out of God by some kind of necessity and without a personal freedom of God, then one would end up with either with a pantheism or with a complete atheism, or with a acosmism, saying that the world must be an illusion. So I think the 5 ways of St. Thomas can all be interpreted in terms of the personhood of God, which results from each of these ways and above all from their union. But I cannot develop that anymore. I think also the ontological argument, of which I'm a great defender, is ultimately a completely personalistic proof of the existence of God. And I think there are specific personalistic arguments from gratitude, from love, from the moral order, arguments for the existence of God, which, for example, John Henry Newman very much put in the center. And those, I think, are very, very important to develop further, to have a well-rounded and metaphysical, personalistic philosophy. I could explain more, but I have such this fear, which of John Crosby, which John Henry denied to have, and so I will not anymore. His father denied to have the fear of John Henry, and I have fear of both John Crosby, father and son, and therefore I do not speak more.
All right. Well, thank you. I was intending to focus especially on the problem of embodiment, and as you heard, Professor Crosby elaborated many of the fundamental problems there quite well. So I'm going to truncate my comments a little bit and try to leave a little bit more room for questions and answers, perhaps answers. I don't know if you noticed, but most people in this world are not professional philosophers. And therein lies one of the central difficulties within personalism. We have heard many rich accounts of personalism. I've spent a fair bit of time trying to make connections between contemporary personalism and the tradition and start throwing out chapter and verse of Aristotle and Aquinas. That can be alienating and off-putting. How do we communicate the richness of personalism, the richness of the tradition with those who have not been formed in it. And that formation oftentimes can take a great many years. So I think one of the truly central challenges for each of us is to find ways to communicate with those who have not experienced what we've experienced. I inserted this chapter from a collection of essays by Alistair McIntyre, What is a Human Body? Not just to raise the question of embodiment that Professor Crosby has looked at, but for methodological reasons. On page 87 of this work, which is 234 in the collection, McIntyre says something, and he says this in a number of his essays. He says, about the truth of some of these answers that he's going to provide, he has 7 distinct ways of thinking about what a human body is. He says, I may of course be mistaken, and I will be shown to be mistaken if plain, unphilosophical, or not yet philosophical persons prove unable to recognize the truth of what I assert, even after adequate reflection. That's, I think, a good standard. If those with whom we share our ideas, who've not been trained in whatever tradition we work out of, are sincere in their attempts to make sense of what we're saying, and they can't, the problem does not lie with them, the problem lies with us. Right? And so I think we need to cultivate unique and creative ways to share these ideas. With respect to how to do that with the human body, McIntyre gives us a model here. He calls this a pre-philosophical reflection. I would call it, in large part, a phenomenological reflection, in a strict sense in some of the passages. And he doesn't call it that except in one little place, because he doesn't want to alienate those who say, well, I'm an analytic philosopher. I'm not going to read a phenomenological essay. Or I'm a Thomist. Why should I bother with a phenomenological essay? Or I'm a whatever. And this effort to avoid jargon can sometimes seem clunky because his sentences, and this just might be part of his own way of writing, but it's an attempt, right? I'm not suggesting that we imitate his writing style, but rather the goal of communicating clearly with those who are not philosophically trained. So he examines what a human body is from a number of points of view, and most of them have to do with the way in which the body is communicative. And he argues quite simply that the body is an expression of the mind. With respect to our intentions, with respect to our physical cues, with respect to our use of language, and in many other ways, this is what the body fundamentally is. It's an expression of the mind. But as such, there's always a certain enigma to the body. So just one other quotation on page 241 of the packet, 100 of the essay, he writes, and so the exercise of the powers of the body through time, in the exercise of agency, requires a variety of types of engagement with others. To have understood this is a key to understanding better the relationship between our use of the first person pronoun I and our use of the expression my body. When I first use I speak as agent and patient, as one who acts, suffers, and responds. I refer to and present myself to others as responsible and responsive. When I use my body, I refer to and present myself to others in quite another way. For I can be said to be answerable for my actions and to be able or unable to control this or that bodily movement. But my body cannot be said to be so answerable. I am aware or unaware of this or that bodily movement. My body is neither aware nor unaware. My body presents itself to others. It does not present itself to me. It is because we are specifically human bodies, that is, embodied minds, that we need two modes of self-reference. And that we do need both modes is itself a salient fact about the kind of body we are. So he's reflecting here in his own unique way on elements of this tension between personality and individuality. Personality expresses itself through the body, through our materiality. And we need others to be responsive to us. We need to respond to others. And herein lies the great challenge with respect to virtual reality, social media, and all the other forms of mediated contact with other human beings. For those of a certain age, the use of electronic devices is not so problematic because we've learned how to communicate. We've discovered ourselves. We've discovered our friends. We've had a whole lifetime of human contact that's not mediated through digitized sources. But for young people today, much of their life is thus mediated. It is not uncommon to see a 1 or 2-year-old child manipulating an iPad or an iPhone. It really is not. And what one needs is an opportunity to be detached from such sources in order to discover who one is and to make sense of others. So I do think that we are connected in many ways. I'm distant from my wife. I'm distant from my children during this trip. I'm able to stay in some contact with them through my electronic device that I'm carrying around in my pocket. And yet, it's not the same thing. We know that. So I don't mean to suggest that we ought to become Luddites and destroy all of this rich technological resource. But we do need to find ways to awaken people to the reality of other people so that they look at each other. I don't know if you've noticed, but young people are having a harder and harder time looking you in the eye. It's very difficult for them. When they answer questions, they look away. The gaze of the eye has become a real difficulty. That's right. And emotions are typically expressed through these media. And they're far more intimate sounding than what one would ever exchange in a conversation, which I guess leads to a kind of false intimacy that's not grounded in their embodied existence, right? So that's one problem with this. Another problem is a kind of inability to sit with oneself, right? There's nothing more terrifying than being alone without any kind of distraction being fed in for many people. Many young people cannot withstand, in fact, this was tested empirically, they can't be without their electronic devices. They'd rather die, it seems. Now, this is because it's changing. It's changing our experience of who we are. It's changing what we mean by community, and we're finding that folks are. I think of it as a new kind of sloth, actually, where one is prevented from serious reflection or social engagements of an embodied sort because of these endless distractions. Sloth is not just laying down all the time and taking a nap or procrastinating, right? There's a sloth of hyper busyness in responding to every kind of communication that comes one's way. And this has become a cultural problem. So to return to where I began, we know that this is problematic. We have resources to meet this problem. We need to find modes of communication. We need to become Socratic. We need to become little Socrateses. We need to find ways to encourage those with whom we communicate to ask questions, to teach them how to ask a reflective question, to become self-reflective. So that's the challenge that I leave for each of you.